Welcome to Intersecting Voices, a podcast where diverse stories collide to inspire change and amplify voices. Welcome everyone to a new episode of Intersecting Voices. Today we're joined by the incredible Natalie Collins to explore deeply personal and pressing issues, one that affects 1 in 3 women globally and around 2 million women in the UK alone. I'm talking about domestic abuse. Domestic abuse isn't just physical, it can be emotional, it can be psychological, it can be financial, sexual, and it doesn't just affect adults, but the children in the household too. Natalie lived through this experience many years ago with 2 young children. She found the courage to flee an abusive partner, and that's a choice that changed the course of her life, but also of many other women too. Because out of that pain and deep sense of injustice, Natalie created something extraordinary, the Own My Life Sisterhood. She worked with professionals in adult and child psychology, amongst others, to build a transformative healing journey, one designed for women like her and like me, trying to make sense of what they've been through and find a path forward. Own My Life has since been adopted by a number of charities that support women through trauma, including Women's Aid. And Natalie has also become a powerful advocate, speaking at events and in the media on behalf of women who've experienced or are experiencing domestic abuse. And personally, I've had the privilege of volunteering my time as a translator for the Own My Life course, helping bring this program to Spanish-speaking communities. And Natalie, you and I have been exchanging emails for a few years now, but this is actually the first time I talk to you, and it's so exciting to have you here. And now you've also actually written a book. I just found out when we were talking before, Out of Control, which explains, the dynamics of coercive control, and it gives a little bit of your experience as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the book's called Out of Control, Couples Conflict and the Capacity for Change. Recently, just earlier this year, we've published the audiobook version of the book, which I'll provide you a link to a free chapter so people can see if it works for them. And it essentially helps. It's primarily for those who are supporting someone who's being subject to abuse. And the reality is most of us will know people who are subject to abuse and don't actually know it. So everybody needs to read this book because it will help them to support people in their lives that they at this point don't realize that's what's going on. So the book is designed to help you with a problem you don't know you need help with yet. So it's a tricky thing to try to convince people to read. But so that book is really designed to help people to understand abuse in a way that's quite different than the Own My Life course does, but hopefully in ways that bring transformation as well.
Okay, let's maybe start with the Own My Life course, actually. I'm quite familiar with that one. So can you tell us what is it, why was it done, and who for?
Yes, so I've worked on issues around men's violence towards women since about 2009. So I started delivering courses for women in the community who'd been subject to abuse. I then wrote a course for young people called the Day Programme, which I began training practitioners across the UK to run with young people to do preventative work. When I was working with women, I just kept thinking, do you know what, we all needed this when we were about 12. And it feels a bit like the horse has kind of bolted by the time we need that course. So I spend it's still, the Day Programme still runs and we still train practitioners to deliver it, and it uses music that's recently been in the charts to help practitioners to work in a really meaningful and transformational way with young people. And as if people have seen the Netflix series Adolescence, that has been bringing up lots of conversations about what do we do with young people, one of the things we need to do is have really meaningful conversations about the wider cultural context with young people. For too long, it's become this kind of quite individualized conversation about young people's own kind of internal ideas and what they think about relationships without linking that with the broader cultural context. And so in about 2014, after I'd been developing and delivering day training across the UK, I started to think, you know what, there's something missing in the way that we are working with women who've been subject to abuse. And I started to look at what I needed for my own journey, which I can talk a bit more about, my own journey. But basically, I spent from about 2014 to 2018 in my spare time trying to develop something that would bring a lot of the stuff that I felt was missing. 2018 got some funding to then complete the writing of the course, to pilot the course in 2019, and in 2020 to start delivering. And it's a comprehensive journey, really, that enables women to understand that what abuse is, because very often when we've been subject to abuse, we don't even recognize that's what it is. There's lots and lots of psychological challenges with that, because nobody wants to be one of those women, those women who are abused. All of us would say, well, no, I'm not like that. I'm strong and I'm capable and I'm competent. And he's not like that. He's just got some problems. And nobody wants to kind of sit themselves in the category of being abused.
Oh,
And
that
so,
sounds so familiar.
yeah, yeah.
It's almost like you're reading my mind, and it's true. Like, there is no type, isn't there? Like, I thought, like,
No,
I was so angry with myself, to be honest, for a while, because I was like, how did I not see it for 10 bloody years? 10 years.
yeah,
How
yeah.
did I
And I
not see it?
No, exactly. And it's what we end up being able to do is we need to understand that there isn't such a thing as those women. And one of the challenges we have is that the work to respond to domestic abuse has ended up kind of creating a those women category. So when you look at news stories about domestic abuse, when you look at the kind of, and not all services, but there is a tendency within services to portray women who are subject to abuse as essentially being quite passive, being, a woman with like a bruised face cowering in a corner, and nobody looks at that and goes, yes, that's me. Even if we've ever been cowering in a corner, but we don't see ourselves in that way. And so one of the challenges is, how do we broaden out the kind of image of who's subject to abuse, to say this anybody can be subject to abuse, and actually a perpetrator doesn't have to look this way or that way in order to perpetrate abuse. And so so wanted to really make sure that we were enabling women to go, oh, this is me. There's lots of stuff around trauma we've understood about the science of trauma. Trauma science has kind of been developing from the 80s, and now we have really robust knowledge over kind of 45 years now. We have really robust knowledge about what's going on in our brains and our bodies, but that information very often stays in the hands of practitioners and specialists and trauma experts, and actually very rarely gets to traumatize people, because it requires a level of science literacy, which not lots of people don't know what the amygdala is. And so it can be really hard when we're trying to understand for ourselves. We end up having to read the whole of Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score if we want to get it, and actually it's got a lot of pages. And so what I wanted to do was bring a lot of that trauma science to traumatized women in the most accessible and quickest way possible, so we're not having to read really long books if we don't have time. And so also I wanted to connect those wider societal messages that all of us as women are subject to, with the kind the stuff we've been subject to personally. And so often we are led to think that there's something personally, like you just said then, why I was so angry with myself because why did this, was this done to me for 10 years and I didn't notice and I didn't see it? And it's like, well, actually, because from when we're born as girls, we're being conditioned to accept certain behavior. I've recently had a grandson, and it was fascinating that before he was born, I was had the privilege of being at his birth. And when my daughter was in labour, and things were getting a bit tricky, the midwives were saying things like, oh, is he a boy? Yeah, because boys are difficult. And then after he's born and, she's trying to feed him, oh, he's a bit lazy because he's a boy. And it's like, right, he's like less than a day old and you've said he's difficult and lazy. No wonder there's so many arsehole men. Like if from like before they're born, we're already saying they're difficult and lazy. And so, from before birth, we are getting messages about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And then when we end up in a relationship with somebody who is difficult and lazy, rather than going, that's not okay, we go, oh, well, that's what we should expect from a relationship. That's what we should expect. That's what we have to do. Women have to do all the emotional labor. And so there's lots of messages we receive as women and as girls, which mean if we end up in a relationship with somebody who wants to take advantage of those messages, it's very, very difficult for us to identify and recognize that. And so I wanted to make sure that what Own My Life did wasn't just about me and my individual life, or even me and my kind of trauma, but also said me and the world that I live in. And so that Own My Life covers all of that stuff over a 12-week course that's usually about 2.5-hour sessions. And what we do centrally is we train practitioners who then deliver Own My Life to women in local contexts. And so far, over 15,000 women have gone through Own My Life courses around the UK and Ireland. And we've just had a pilot course in Australia. So we're going a bit further afield as well.
That's amazing. I hope it gets everywhere in the world, because honestly, this is the best thing that I've ever seen in my life. I think it was, one of the first things, I think, as someone who's been through domestic abuse, is the why. Why is a huge thing. And you keep thinking like, well, did they have a choice? Obviously, no, they couldn't have had a choice, because why would they choose to hurt me? And it's not a little, it's not like the physical hurt itself. It's a lot worse than that. And I think people don't see that what comes, the harm, the invisible harm, let's say, is a lot more difficult to deal with. It's a lot more difficult. It lasts for a lot longer as well. And I couldn't understand why. And your course gave me the why, and it was so obvious then. It allowed me to be in peace with myself, because then also allowed me to understand myself better. So it wasn't just about him; it was about me as well, and that's it's so valuable.
The why is such a big part of us trying to make sense of what's going on, that we just think, if I understood why, if I could only understand why. And when we're in that relationship, the reason why we're doing that is because we want to feel like we have some power to change it. If I understood why, then I could take appropriate action to change it. Because what we don't want to end the relationship. Potentially we've got children with this person, we have committed our life to them, we want to make it worth something. And if the relationship ends, all of that horrible stuff they've done to us becomes worthless. It becomes pointless. Whereas if we can find a way through and a way to kind of redeem it all, suddenly it's like, well, one day it'll be worth it, because all of this pain that he's put me through will be eventually redeemed into a beautiful relationship, and we'll live happily ever after, and that'll make this difficult time okay. And actually the why is about us trying to find a way through and to feel we have some control and power, because essentially when someone's abusing us, what they are doing is leading us to a position where we have no power, where we have no control. And so that desperation for why, definitely was the same for me, this sense of why, if I can just understand why, then I can do something. I can decide to end it, or I can this, or I can that, or I can find a way to fix it. And so I think understanding why, and what we explain within Own My Life, and is really well established within all of the research and work around perpetration of abuse, is that those who abuse believe they own their partner, and they are entitled, they have the right to do what they want to their partner. And out of those beliefs of ownership and entitlement, they control their partner. And so once we start to see that those dynamics are at play, suddenly it's like, oh, yeah, no, that suddenly everything will fall into place, because then we're like, yeah, no, so it's not coming out of he's not angry, or he might appear angry, but actually it's because I have offended his sense of entitlement. He thinks he has more rights than me. And the problem is that the messages we've often heard from society is that he's insecure, that he desires to control us because he's insecure, and his security comes through somehow like controlling someone else. Often people will think that about an abuser. Oh, these are weak men who, are just insecure, and, and this kind of thing. That's not what's going on at all. This is somebody who thinks that he's better than his partner, who thinks he has more rights than his partner. And once we start to realize that, it changes our ability to respond, because suddenly we're like, oh, what? So, because what an abuser will do all the time is make us feel that their feelings are more important than ours. And so once we realize he believes that he's entitled and he believes that he owns me, suddenly we're not thinking, oh, bless him, it's so hard for him because of his poor childhood, or it's so hard for him because of his difficult job. Suddenly we're like, he thinks he's entitled. And the problem is, when we soothe him, when we offer lots of empathy, when we offer lots of understanding, what we do is we prop up that entitlement, we prop up that ownership, because and actually everyone around him's doing that too. Everybody, when he goes to the pub and he says to his mates, oh, my wife's right, she's like a right, this, that, and the other. And they go, oh, I know, mate, my missus, blah, 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 blah. And so wherever they go, they're constantly having this reinforcement, even from professionals, if social workers are involved, if the school are involved. Very often they will all offer what the moral philosopher Kate Mann calls himpathy, which is the undeserved empathy that we offer to men who are perpetrating abuse or doing terrible things to women. So I think understanding that transforms everything for us, and then it enables us to operate very differently in relation to the perpetrator, but also in relation to everyone else, because we might be saying that to our friends and family. Oh, well, he can't help it because it's really difficult for him because, and suddenly we're like, he can't help it. Oh, he's making a choice here, is he? And suddenly that's really transformational. And the other thing that is really important to understand is that abusive behavior is really beneficial to the abuser. That actually, when we go, why is he doing it? Well, he's doing it because he gets him what he wants. He gets everything he wants whenever he wants, and he doesn't have to do any work for it. Well, actually, that seems like a pretty logical, cause and effect. I treat her like that, so she does what I want. I tell her that her friend is annoying, and so she stops seeing that friend. And then suddenly my life's a bit easier. I tell her that she's not doing this that I want, or that what I want, and I make her feel guilty and I gaslight her, then I get what I want. This is a cause and effect situation. And until we understand abusive behavior is beneficial, rather than, thinking of it as an outworking of trauma or distress, we're going to prop up those entitlement and the benefits, and everyone around him is going to be doing that, which is really hard if we want to see change.
Oh, that's quite interesting. I've just learned something there, actually. I thought I was under the impression that deep inside they do feel less than others. They may become appear really arrogant outside, but I thought, deep inside it was, that kind of, they don't feel good enough, so they just use the one person they can control to make up for it. But it's interesting that they actually, that they do believe in that sense of entitlement. And I did think for a very long time, actually, during those 10 years, there was always excuses. It's my work. It's, I had childhood trauma. I had depression. I may be neurodivergent. And then I always thought like, oh yeah, poor him. Maybe if that changes, things will change. But, things changed then. The situation never changed. And then I realized, I suppose, that the first thing that I learned from all my life is he has a choice. And he chooses to. And I thought, well, actually, yeah, that makes sense, because I'm all the things that he said he was. And I chose, not to abuse anyone. There's many people in the world in his situation that choose not to abuse. So it is a choice, isn't it? And that's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing, but it's also the thing that frees you to finally see them for who they are. It is a choice, and they chose to hurt you.
Yeah, and I think it's very painful, and so we want to spend a lot of time trying to imagine that there is something where he doesn't have a choice. And the reality is, he doesn't do that to other people in his life. There are a tiny minority of perpetrators who are very violent people generally, often those involved in organized crime, who might be, where the women that they're in relationships with are dealing with particular levels of violence, and which is across their life. But for the vast majority of perpetrators, they are not exhibiting those behaviors in any other relationships, in their workplace, in their family, in their friends. They are specifically doing it to us, and they're using our children as part of that if we have children. And so there's something about that is a choice, because I think sometimes there's this idea, maybe it's about lack of emotional literacy, maybe it's about not being able to communicate properly. He's incredibly good at communicating, which is why he manages to manipulate us back every time we try and leave. You know, like actually that requires really, really good skills in knowing how to play somebody, how to kind of to feed into their stuff. And so there is this idea that these men are emotionally illiterate, that they are, you know, kind of struggling with certain sorts of pain that is unbearable. And the reality is that most women are dealing with pain at a level that is at least as bad as the men men in the world. You know, the reality is of childhood abuse, of sexism, of misogyny. Women are generally, as a rule, subject to greater levels of harm than men, as a rule. And so, you know, if pain and trauma was the biggest factor in becoming a perpetrator, the majority of perpetrators will be women, and they're not. The majority of the perpetrators, about 97% of perpetrators, are men. And that's not to say that men are awful. You know, like some of my best friends are men, you know, but actually this isn't about men being awful, but this is about there being something that goes on in society that's not about childhood trauma, that's not about emotional difficulties, that means that men go on to perpetrate abuse at levels that we just don't see women doing. And that is because we live in a society which promotes ideas of ownership and entitlement for men. From where before children are born, we're saying to boys, oh, he's difficult and lazy. And we're not giving women those free passes. We're not giving girls those free passes. And so what we know is that all through life, you know, if anybody listening has girl children, they will often know that their girl children will be sat next to the naughty boy in the school class. If their girl is compliant, she'll get sat next to the naughty boy, because it's the girl's job to kind of, you know, work to ensure the behavior of that boy. And that gives all sorts of messages from childhood about what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, and what it means to relate to one another, and who's responsible for whose behavior. And when we start there and we look at the bigger picture, it's no wonder that we're dealing with the challenges we have, but it's why we need to work very hard to change it.
One of the other things that I heard a lot through my relationship was anger management. So he has issues with anger management, and he kept saying that. And, you know, that was the excuse. And I remember, so the last year of the relationship, I was involved with women's aid quite a lot, like preparing that ground to leave. That's how hard it is to leave a relationship like that. And so I said, like, he has anger management issues, and they told me that this, I'll remember this forever. It's like, oh, that does he have problems with keeping the anger in public? And I said, no, it's just in private. It's like, oh, so what you're really telling me is that he's a pro at anger management. Because otherwise, if he had problems with anger management, you know, he'd be doing it everywhere, but he's only choosing to do it with you. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, but it's the prerogative that you hear everywhere, you know. Poor him, he has anger management issues. Just help him deal with that. You know, if you're able to do everything right as a partner, then maybe you'll be able to help them through that anger management. Just another excuse, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's actually the dynamic that's going on with somebody who's perpetrating abuse is that he has a set of rules. Those rules come from his sense of ownership and entitlement. My partner should get my dinner when I say. She should give me sex on demand. She should keep the kids quiet. The kids are her responsibility. Don't want to have any friends. She can't talk to her family. She needs to serve my needs above her needs. You know, those are the sorts of rules. And they may be explicit. He may say to us, you're not allowed to see your friend. He might say to us, don't let your mum in this house anymore. Or it might be just that when we do those things, suddenly some sort of consequence emerges and we rack our brains. Why is he not spoken to me for 3 weeks? And then we go, oh, this started after that. And so we start to modify our behavior. And we start to think, if I obey the rules, and we wouldn't necessarily use this language or perceive it this way, oh, if I do that, then he gets cross. And if I don't do that. And so we start to modify our behavior to try to keep the peace, to keep things how he wants them. And so what happens though is the reality is nobody has the right to hold a set of rules on another adult that they're supposed to be in a mutual equal relationship with. So at some point we're going to break the rules. We might do that on purpose. You know, one of my favorite stories is a woman who before her partner would sexually assault her, he would brush his teeth. And so she took to brushing the toilet with his toothbrush. And I'm like, yes, come on. And she, she every time he was sexually assaulting her, part of her was like, telling her, very delighted that she knew that he had done that. And that gave her a bit of strength of power and a sense of self in that. And so it may be that we go out of our way to break the rules, to just be like, to give a FU to him, which is about us sitting in our power. And that shows just how badass women are, right? That even when we are being subject to this stuff, we do stuff to break the rules. And the challenge is that very often, if we tell anyone how we've broken the rules, they blame us, and we end up feeling very ashamed of the things that we've done to resist him, because we feel like, oh, rather than going, nobody gives us an award and goes, well done. You fought back in whatever way you could. And we always fight back. Nobody just sits back and does everything they're told. But so we might deliberately break those rules, but we might break those rules because he changes the rules, or because something, that our child needs to go to hospital, or something occurs, which means we can't. And then what happens is, at that point when the rules are broken, he starts to wind himself up. Who does she think she is? I look after her, and this is how she treats me. And so there is this winding up that happens. There is this anger that will often manifest, but it's not coming from a place of where our anger might come from because of how he treated us. It's not coming from the same place that anger generally comes from in kind of humans. It's coming from the beliefs of ownership and entitlement, from the rules, and those rules being broken. And so if you want to address an abuser's behavior, you have to go back to the ownership and entitlement, and the fact that he thinks it's appropriate to have a set of rules for his partner, and that he can punish her if she breaks those rules. And so it feels and looks very much like anger, but materially the way you resolve it is not by anger management, because as you say, your ex-partner was an expert in managing his anger. It's not that. It's that what we need to deal with is something that's not the anger. That is just the kind of visible manifestation of what is going on behind the scenes, which is the rules and the ownership and entitlement.
So one big question as well, not so much for the people who have been in a relationship of this sort, but for people who haven't, is why doesn't she leave? And one of the things, so I remember, like, through the whole relationship, I'm talking about a decade, or most of it anyway, there was cycles. So there you find like the really nice version of him, the person that you fell in love, and then you'll see the awful part of him. So it was like there was these two people in him, and I remember thinking, like, when he was nice, I really loved him. It was like he made me feel like home, and this is part of the intersectionality as well. So I was diagnosed with ADHD. Was it a year ago, actually, only? So for all my life, my whole life, I didn't feel like I fit in, even though, in the outside it may look like it. I didn't feel like, my needs, my emotional needs were met. And he was the one person who made me feel like, he was home to me. Obviously, he was just pretending that was the nice part of him. But I guess what I didn't know back then is that the nice version of him didn't exist. It was manufactured. The awful version of him, that was him. That's what I didn't know. And through the whole relationship, it was like a roller coaster. And I remember, like, thinking to myself quite a few times, it's like, okay, well, I don't think I'll ever get the nice version of him only. I think I'm always going to get the two. So I have to decide whether the I guess the good version of him compensates for the bad version of him. And when I look back now, I realize that the good version of him was just a like normal, like minimum investment kind of version of him. I guess, what I knew about relationships was not very balanced, was it? It is like, I thought that was a really nice, relationship when he was nice. It wasn't. It was just bare minimum. But I guess, when I, towards the end, he forgot to show the nice part of him. And then I suppose it was easier for me to see him for who he was. I mean, no one wants to go through all the shit if you don't get anything nice out of it, isn't it? So for the, well, having talked about this, for the people who wonder, well, why didn't she just leave? What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I think, I think you've probably given a lot of those explanations of why, that within the Own My Life course, we use the work of a guy called Albert Biderman, who researched the ways that prisoners of war were treated and forced to make false confessions. And one of the aspects of that was occasional indulgences. So occasionally the captors would behave in ways that were nice and were kind and would give them presents and that kind of thing. And we see that is a natural part of being human. So if somebody kidnaps us and they say you're not allowed to go to the toilet for 24 hours, and then 3 hours in they say you can go to the toilet, our first emotion is not anger or outrage at how we've been treated. Our first emotion is relief and gratitude. Thank you so much for letting me go to the toilet. And that's the same with a perpetrator. But actually, when somebody is being awful to us, when they do something nice, that takes on remarkable and epic proportions. So one of my red flags, if I'm, all the time, I can't help it, all the time, whenever somebody's talking to me about their relationship, there's like this kind of scoring going on in my head. It goes up and down as they speak, and it may be that they, they say something, I go, oh, red flag, and then it sort of goes on, and I think we should all be thinking about our own relationship and our friends and family. If we care about people, we should be considering, is there something untoward going on here? And very often there isn't, but proportionally 25% of women will be subject to abuse. That's a quarter of the women we know at some point in their life will be subject to abuse. And so we need to always be asking questions about, when they're talking about their mental health issues, when they're talking about the challenges they're having with their kids, when they're talking about the relationship challenges they're having, proportionally some of the time that will be because their partner is abusive. And unless we identify that, we're not going to be able to support them well. But so if somebody says to me, oh, my partner's really great, he took the kids to the park 3 weeks ago, I feel like being like, well done him, shall we give him a certificate? Because actually, since I've been married to my my now husband for going towards 20 years. Do you know what? And when the kids were little, I wouldn't have remembered 3 weeks ago he took the kids to the park, because that would be an entirely unremarkable, irrelevant thing, and so he does most of the cooking, most of the cleaning. Do you know? And like, at no point do I think to make a remark upon that, because that's just being a decent partner who shares the responsibilities for our household, right? But actually, if we're in a relationship with somebody who doesn't ever take the kids out, who doesn't do the housework, who doesn't support us, who is emotionally unpleasant, who's gaslighting us, who's being sexually violent, whatever they're doing, being physically violent, whatever that person's doing, controlling our finances, the one time when they don't do that thing, not only do we feel like, oh, they're great, we feel like they're amazing, because today they didn't make us do that thing they normally do, or today they didn't shout at the kids. And so our standards and our baseline becomes completely different. And that's deliberate. That's not us being, there's nothing wrong with us. That is a process he takes us through. And what you described about how, as the relationship progressed, there became less and less occasional indulgences, that is because those occasional indulgences are about ensuring his rules are followed, ensuring that he gets what he wants, and that the benefits are all his. And so as the relationship develops, we become more compliant to the rules, because he's created that. That's not us, we're not actively choosing to do that. We're trying to constantly, we're resisting where we can, we're doing what we can, but we're also worn down and exhausted, we're tired, we are just learning that if I do this, life's a bit easier. And so we do that. And so what happens is, as we become more adhering to the rules, he has to do less rewarding us to get us to do what he wants. And so that disintegrates. Those occasional indulgences become more and more occasional. And so understanding the function of those occasional indulgences, and the hard thing is that other people in our lives reinforce that. So I don't know what our mum says, oh, I don't know what you're moaning about, your dad never did anything in the house. And our dad might not have been a perpetrator, but actually they had a quite traditional relationship. The fact that our partner is exhausting us through that and expecting us to work full time and do the housework and never bother them with the kids' needs or whatever. So people in our life are also reinforcing, oh, well, he's a really good dad because he took the kids to the park 3 weeks ago, rather than going, that's not even the bare minimum for being an active parent.
Yeah,
So
you're like, I'm taking them like every day. He takes them like once every 3 months, and suddenly he gets all the credit.
Yeah, that's it. Are we such a good dad? Is he? Because I think he's probably not a very good, the standard of motherhood and the standard of female partnerhood are so much higher than they are for fathers and male partners. So I think understanding that occasionally indulgences is important. Also, another reason why it's hard to leave an abuser is when we are under threat. The first thing we will do when we are threatened and when we are, in a state of physical or emotional threat is seek out attachment. And normally, in a normal kind of situation where we have friends and family and colleagues and all of that kind of stuff, those attachments will be kind of multifold. We'll talk to our mom, and we'll talk to our sister, and we'll talk to our friend, and we'll talk to our work colleague, and we'll have these kind of multiple attachments for that threat. If we're in a car accident, we can then process it with all those different people. However, when we're in a relationship with an abuser, one of the core things that an abuser does is isolate us. So they alienate us from our family and friends. They sabotage our work, so we lose our job. And suddenly what we discover is the only person that we've got to attach to is him. And then when there's a threat, when he creates that threat, when he threatens us physically or emotionally, whatever he does financially, whatever he does to threaten us, our body needs to attach. It needs to maintain connection. And this goes back, this is evolutionary. Babies will die if they don't retain an attachment to their mother, right? And so human beings are made for attachment. We're made for love. And that is an amazing and incredibly beautiful thing about being a human being. But when an abuser has actively manipulated and coerced us into a situation where we don't have anyone else, when they threaten us, when they hurt us, when they cause us all of that pain, we still need to attach. And that need for attachment doesn't distinguish and go, oh no, they're the perpetrator, we shouldn't be attaching to them, they're the one causing the pain. Actually, what happens is the only attachment we've got is to them. And so the intensity of that attachment is greater than to any of the other people in our lives. This is attachment theory. It's a very robust understanding about how human beings are. The challenge is that sometimes there's books and people who talk about this attachment to an abuser and say that there's something to do with us as women, if we are being abused, that we have some sort of unhealthy attachment style, or that's nonsense. This isn't about us. This is natural. Every human being in a state of threat seeks attachment. And the problem is that the abuser has isolated us from everyone else. The problem is the abuser. And so that attachment means that then we are kind of traumatically attached to that perpetrator. And so when we try and leave, we'll feel really like, oh no, but I really love them. And we live in a context where the messages about romance and love is that if this love defies all rationality, then it must be deeper and more meaningful than anything else, rather than if it's defying rationality, it might be unhealthy. If it's defying rationality, maybe he's dangerous. And so that's another part of it. Another part of it is that when we have been in a situation of ongoing threats and trauma, our adrenaline and cortisol, which are our stress hormones, become very wonky. And that is for every human being. This isn't about a certain sort of woman. This is every single human being. That adrenaline and cortisol will be out of balance. And when we come into a place of calm, where we're not in an ongoing state of threat and trauma, while those stress hormones get balanced, we will often feel worse than we did in the situation, because there's this kind of process of kind of getting into equilibrium, and that process from the ongoing threats to the equilibrium can be brutally hard. And when we're in that situation, what we think is, he was right, I can't survive without him. He was right, I feel worse now than I did when I was with him, because it's all my fault. And so the meaning that he has given us is the meaning that we take on. And so this is about the abuser's behavior and our natural, normal, healthy strategies for surviving as a physical strategy for survival. When they're brought together with a perpetrator, it creates all sorts of situations where we might make choices based on what we think is the right thing to do, and actually we're doing it based on our body being in a wonky place, based on his behavior, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's quite interesting as well. One of the things that I got told by, so this is me just fresh left the relationship, and women said, allocate me a counsellor that was specific to domestic abuse. And she told me, most of women, when you ask them, what do you want from men? They don't say respect, or equality, or they ask for, they want men to be powerful, to be protective. And that's the kind of narrative that we've been sold, isn't it? So it is true that you can see it a lot in literature and films. You see this man. You can see all the red flags. I can see them now. You see all the red flags, but it's the romantic thing is for the woman to try to pursue that man and change him, so that he's going to then go from awful to amazing, just out of love for her. And I saw these things. You said it before. Abuse is not always that easy to spot. I mean, they don't always tell you shall not do that. I mean, I remember one of the first things that he told me, and I thought, oh, look, he cares so much about me. Like he told me that I couldn't go cycling to work because it was dangerous, because there was lots of lorries around. And I thought, okay, yeah, I suppose he cares about me. And when I thought about it later, it's like, fucker. I mean, he was trying to control me, wasn't he? That was the start of it. I mean, he was taking his bike everywhere, and it wasn't an issue. It's we mistake caring and love for control. It's quite easy for women to fall in that.
Yeah, in a few years ago when 50 Shades was massive, so when the books were out, and I ended up setting a campaign about the 50 Shades series to talk about how it was abuse. And because the two stories that were in the media were it's bad because sex, or it's good because sex, or it's bad because the writing, or it's good because loads of people are reading it. And I read the whole series, and literally you cannot go for more. Any page that he is in, Christian Grey is in that book, there is abuse. Every single page. The only points where there isn't abuse is the monologue in her head that goes on. And I wanted to talk about how this is about abuse. And so I ended up doing lots and lots of media work around that. And I was on this radio show randomly in Dublin. And they did a call in, like a poll, an online poll or whatever, while I was on air, to say, is 50 Shades about abuse? And the presenter was like, Natalie, the poll is in. 94% of our listeners think it's not abuse. What do you say to that? And that 50 Shades is a really good example of how little literacy we have as a society, because as an expert in abuse, I can tell you categorically that there is abuse on nearly every page. And I'm not even talking about the kind of the sexual, the rough sex stuff. I'm talking about his general, behavior towards her. But the fact that 94% of the listeners to this radio show didn't think it was abuse is not indicative it's not abuse, but 94% of people don't know what abuse is. And so the challenge is that with the message that 50 Shades brought, which I actually think, if we trace back the use of rough sex in relationships, if we look at the normalization of strangulation within relationships, the idea that you can consent to be strangled, the reality is that strangulation is a very dangerous thing to do. You can't do it safely. Strangulation in any form, but particularly in sex, can lead to strokes, can lead to brain damage, even if somebody doesn't die or doesn't pass out. So, categorically, the fact that we're talking about consenting to strangulation is really troubling as a society. Like, if somebody gets aroused by being strangled or somebody strangling them, they just need to realize that that's just too dangerous. But that the messages that 50 Shades brought, and the normalization of abuse within that book, and that nobody, like lots and lots of people, didn't know it was abuse, didn't recognize the abuse. They thought it was erotic, they thought it was a really profound love story, when it was exactly what you're describing. This man who is very dangerous, who is controlling his partner in numerous ways, and has a lot more power than she does, in terms of age, in terms of status, in terms of finances, and how that was being portrayed as the love story of a generation. And so for sure, the messages that we receive, and making those visible to us as women, but also to men, enables us to make much better, more informed choices about the sorts of relationships we want, the sorts of lives we want, and actually to recognize that, like, these are stories we all adhere to, and unless we challenge them, unless we ask questions about them, we are going to end up in trouble somewhere along the way.
So I want to share two examples with you, and hopefully the listeners will see the difference as well. But so I didn't know what coercive control was until, after I left the relationship. So obviously when I was in my early 20s, I had no idea what it was. So I had this friend who, I think she was 19 back then. She had just been through trauma. So she had been sexually assaulted by an ex-boyfriend. And then she was behaving in a way that's I remember it's like, it didn't make sense to me. Why is she doing this? She went back to the ex-boyfriend because she wanted to talk to him, because she wanted to understand why this happened. It's like, why are you doing this? So then she started with a new boyfriend, and this boyfriend, oh wow, I mean, I just saw it like really quick. It was like so obvious. I didn't know what it was, because obviously domestic abuse, no purple eyes or things like that. But it didn't seem right. I mean, he started saying to her, well, you can't go with other boys because otherwise I'll kill myself. I was like, seriously? And then it was about friends, like girlfriends, like he wouldn't let her come with me. And I was like, do you not see what he's doing? I mean, he's isolating you from everyone. Why would you stand for that? Oh, but he's struggling with his mental health. It doesn't matter. I mean, he's isolating you. Why would you stand for that? Oh, but he's jealous because you were there to support me when, this trauma happened, and he wasn't there. It's like, no, it doesn't make sense. So she came to see me to my city, and he came as well, like shortly after, and he demanded that she'd go with him. And I gave her a choice. Now I think about it, I feel like karma got to me. But at the time, I just didn't see it. I said to her, like, look, I can't just be, if you don't want to see it, I can make you see it. I mean, I thought she was being stupid, to be honest. It's like, why would you choose to live with him? It's like, okay, that's your choice. I don't want to be your friend anymore. And it was really clear. I mean, if you see your friends, I'm going to kill myself. That is so obvious. It was to me anyway. So a few years down the line, it happened to me, and it wasn't that obvious at all. It wasn't obvious at all. I mean, it started like what the example I said about the cycling. I mean, I was like, it's so benign, isn't it? Or, like he'd never tell me, don't go and see your friends, but he'll want to come over with me and then be like really grumpy and rude. And it's like, I felt really bad bringing him with me. Little things like that. So it wasn't obvious at all. Like he was isolating me from my friends or family, trying to say like comments about my family just to put that wedge in between. So it really isn't obvious at all. And I hope that the listeners can, acknowledge that anyone can fall for this, anyone. And what I want to say is, for my mom, so you talked about your book as well, like how this is for people to learn how to support others. So for my mom, hats off, because for 10 years, maybe she didn't see it from the beginning, but she's seen it long before I did. And every time I said I was leaving him, she was really excited, and then I'll take it back. And I understand now how much, how hard that must have been. I mean, I told my friend, just to get lost, because I just couldn't understand why she didn't see it, why she didn't leave. But my mom stood there, and she just took the patience 10 years down the line. She went to counseling herself, and because it was tough for her to see. And she was told that, many women take a lot of years and many attempts to leave a relationship between they actually see it. I didn't see it for a very long time. In fact, the last year of the relationship, or the last 3 years actually, I went to Women's Aid because I felt like this is not, something is off, so I was trying to look for information. What is domestic abuse? And so I actually ended up talking to Women's Aid, because the information they had in the website, well, it doesn't really meet that criteria. Is it then, or is it not? So I spoke to them, and they told me it definitely is. He is really abusive, actually. And I remember thinking to myself, I clearly only gave them the bad stuff. I didn't give them good stuff. So I took everything out of context. So I sat with it for a year before going back. And my mom just supported me through the whole time. Every time I told her the things that were happening to me, she'll always listen, but she would never force me to make any decision. And I think that is so difficult for her. So hats off for her. And I wonder, Natalie, in your experience, what is it that people can do to support others who are in an abusive relationship?
Basically, be like your mom.
Everyone
Literally,
should be like my mom.
her own pamphlet on like what did I do, and I think it is just the two things is stay present, stay involved. That what that abuser is doing is trying to sabotage any relationship, anything, not just a relationship, anything that gives someone strength, anything that gives someone strength, anything that gives somebody the capacity to resist, to see they have value, to see that they matter, anything that's going to get in the way of him getting whatever he wants. And so anybody who gives that person strength is going to be on the target list. And so it's not just about saying the opposite of the abuser, but doing the opposite, which is why it's important to understand what an abuser does. So where he says you're worthless, we need to be saying to that person, you're amazing, you're really capable. Where that person is cutting off their choices, we need to be like, do it, there's loads of things you could do. And just showing up, being present, even if he's rude, even if he's unpleasant, all of those things, basically the normal rules of a friendship or a family member relationship have to go out the window. Those expectations, that mutuality. It's like, actually, I just have to stick around. The every day that you remain in that person's life is a success, is you doing the best you can to support that person, and keeping on doing that, like your mom did. Get counseling, get support, so that you can put all of the stress and frustration you feel with that person into another space, so that you can be the best active resource you can to that person, to that woman in that, while she's in that relationship. And so doing the opposite, thinking about, does he make her feel bad? How do we make her feel good? Does he make her feel like a terrible mom? How do we tell her she's a brilliant mom? How do we point out all the ways how do we, if is he taking finances off her? How do we financially resource her? How do we just be available and keep showing up? And I think I think it is really hard. And when, I think, when we're in our early 20s and somebody's doing this and we just think, why are you so stupid? What are you doing? And I like you, what you did was totally understandable. I I had a friend, and a similar situation. Her partner like very quickly moved in, was doing loads of stuff that was such massive red flags. And I tried to do what I'm describing here. I showed up for her, and I'd say things like, I tried to plant seeds. What I always talk about is we need to plant seeds in people's life. Ask questions, be curious, not kind of actively accuse the person of being an abuser. But for instance, one time he left a bottle of water in a bag with the lid off, and it ruined her phone. And I like, it was just like he'd hide her bag in a cupboard just before she had to go out, and I would be like, I would say, I'm not saying it is this, but is there a chance that maybe he did that on purpose because it made you really late, or it made you not be able to see us, or it meant you couldn't use your phone? And I'm not saying he is doing it on purpose, but if he was, that would be worrying, wouldn't it? And I tried to do all the things that I would advise people to do. And then he blew up our car. Genuinely, our car blew up on our, like, thankfully it was on the road, it wasn't on the drive of our house, and it exploded on the in the and I we were like, he couldn't have done it, he couldn't have done it. And I had no contact with her for she was my best friend. I didn't have any contact with her for over a decade. And eventually when I reconnected with her, I said, did he do that? Because at first me and my husband just thought we were being really like melodramatic, like he's done this to us. And she went, yeah, he did blow up your car. And so I think the reality is, even if we do all of the things that I'm telling you to do, the fact is he might escalate his behavior and blow up her car. I mean, that, like, and I would say that, I work in this field, but I'd say that's quite extreme for a behavior for somebody, a perpetrator, to do. So, like, we do the best we can with the knowledge we have. And the reality is, no matter what we do, that perpetrator, if he is intended enough, he is going to interfere with our ability to be the best resource that we can. But all we can do is keep showing up if we can. And that's incredibly challenging. And so as your mum did, finding the resources we can to support that person by getting resourced to be, like, you can't, that whole thing about putting on your own gas mask in the, your oxygen mask before you put on your kids in a plane. I think making sure that we've got the resources, and to see this as we have to no longer see this person as our daughter or our friend or our sister. We have to see this as a person in a crisis, and it's our job to kind of remain as involved as we can, to just show them that there is another world possible, and one day that may come to something. And we have to be sustained, because this might go on for a day, a week, a year, a decade, 20 years, how do what we're offering has to be sustained for as long as it takes. And so that might mean that we don't offer as much as we might want to. And I think sometimes, because what happens, I remember a woman saying to me, oh, my friends only care when I'm in a crisis. And it's like, well, no, because people can't offer you the same amount of resourcing when things are not crisis level, when your partner hasn't tried to kill you, or when the kids aren't in crisis or whatever. But that can often then feel like, oh, they only show up when something's really bad. So how do we offer something that's sustainable, that's unconditional? And so it does require us to do a whole lot of thinking and work about changing the shape of how we see that relationship while they're in that relationship.
One of the other things was financial control. I think that's huge for women to not be able to leave on their abusers. For me, for example, I think I was quite lucky in the fact that from very young, I've seen my mum working really hard, and how. So I come from a working class, so I knew the value of money and financial independence. So I've always had a job, and I always had a really good job. I went through education, higher education and stuff. Um, I mean, the thing is, as a man, he'd earn more money than I did. So he'll go and he saved money, and he's put the money to his name, so I don't have access to it, but it's both's money, and he always tells me this. But whenever I want to access it, I need to ask for permission, and he'll more likely say no than yes. I remember once he tried to encouraged me to leave my job, to move somewhere else, just to be a stay-at-home partner. And I said, well, no. Well, at that time, I was quite happy for him just to leave and never come back, to be honest. But what I see now with my the Own My Life course, we built a sisterhood around it. That's really amazing. I'm still in touch with them. But my situation and their situation is completely different because of the financial position. I never left my job. I had financial independence. I also had my family as well, to be honest. But for most of the people in the sisterhood, they either didn't work, or they maybe have like low earning jobs. So what that means is that they don't have the means to leave them. So it's so difficult. And what I've seen as well, all the systems that are supposed to be in place to protect victims actually work against them. So that's one of the, the I guess, for the listeners, just make sure, like, to protect themselves from abuse, just make sure that you have that independence. But what else would you recommend the listeners to protect themselves?
Yeah, I think understanding the implications of financial control are massive. So if somebody's partner gets them into debt, like, there are women who spend decades paying off debt that their partner's got them into. So I think in any relationship, we need to be asking really serious questions if we're being asked to sign things, if they're trying to kind of push or coerce us into kind of getting out debt, loans or credit cards. So actually being really careful about any financial partnerships in a relationship. Also gambling. So one of the resources we've recently produced for the Own My Life course is for those supporting women around gambling harm. So very often, if a male partner is gambling, his gambling will be part of that abusive behavior. And sometimes women will start gambling to try to bring in enough finance to be able to escape, and actually then end up in their own harmful gambling, because essentially they potentially it's the one thing that they can escape him from by this kind of thing that just is an escapism from the world. It might be that there's a community on the online gambling or gaming platform. So I think understanding the intersection of things like gambling and perpetration, so being aware of that, and very often if a man is being treated for his gambling, a lot of those services around them will expect his partner to support him and forgive him, and do all of the emotional labor and just write off all the things he did when he was gambling. And actually that's not okay, particularly if he's a perpetrator, because that will just reinforce his perpetrator behavior. And then he may say things to her like, the thing is that if you don't do what I want, give me sex now, I'm gonna put a bet on. and that'll be your fault. So I think there's all sorts of things about lots of different factors. So I think in terms of financial control, being literate in finances. We're not taught budgeting. We're not taught how to kind of understand finance in school. So I think anything that gives it, knowledge is power. And so knowledge about our finances is power. Stop economic abuse, have resources. They're an organization who works specifically on financial control. But I think you're right. There's definitely something about the power that women who retain their job. So understanding how we might sabotage employment. There are men who change their partner's alarm clocks, who basically manipulate or force them to stay at home, who behave abusively towards their work colleagues, or don't let them socialize with their work colleagues in a way that might be necessary for improving their position. And what we're doing with Own My Life is a woman, Emma Chandler, who's working with us as a consultant, is looking at how do we get Own My Life into workplaces? How do we give women opportunities to attend an Own My Life course in their work day? So we're looking at developing women's leadership courses based on some Own My Life content to enable that as a route in to start thinking about, actually the biggest barrier to my getting a raise or getting on in work is actually my partner controlling me. Now that's a bit of a journey to go on. So I think the most important thing we can do is look at how do we get educated on finance and educate more generally so we can get the best job we can. How do we kind of build a world that ensures that we have as much control over our finances as possible? And I think that's really hard when you're dealing with somebody who is using all sorts of power and control mechanisms to stop that. So I think if we need to be asking questions about how much knowledge we have about our finances. We need to be asking questions about how much control we have over our finances. My ex-husband used to I was in control of all the money. He was terrible with money, but then he would go on and on and on until I let him buy a new computer part. And so then I'd be expected to try and make the finances work when we didn't have enough money because he'd spent it all on. And so I think there's sometimes we can feel like we're in control of the money, but we've got no power. And so I think sometimes that type of financial control feels a bit confusing because we feel like, because they'll be saying to us, you're stopping me getting the things I want. You're the one controlling me. Why won't you let me buy this? And so we feel like the perpetrator. And often abusers will do that. They will make us feel like we're the ones perpetrating this. They'll tell the police we're the perpetrator. And unfortunately, very often they'll get believed. And so that's really incredibly challenging as well.
Oh, that's quite amazing. There's a lot of advice that you've given the people listening, both supporting, but also the people who are experiencing it. It can be really confusing, and as you say, no one wants to be the victim. We don't want to believe that we've fallen into this, but it's quite normal. And what I'm seeing more and more is that it is everywhere. It's everywhere. I can see it like in the Facebook group that I'm in for mums. Every day you get a post about this, and they don't even know it's abuse. So it is more common than we may think. So whoever is living through this, you're not alone. You're definitely not alone. So just to wrap things up, Natalie, what is next for Own My Life? You've spoken that you're expanding it for other countries. You wanted to expand it to the workplace as well. Anything else?
There's lots and lots going on. So we are currently doing a Polish translation. So Own My Life has about over 30 whiteboard animations. A lot of them explain complex concepts around trauma in accessible ways. The others explain things like a lot of the things that women are dealing with in the society and in the world. So all of those videos and our journal, which you need to attend an Own My Life course, it's an over 200-page journal that is being translated into Polish. So Polish women will have a really meaningful access to Own My Life. We are doing an easy read version of Own My Life for women with learning disabilities. Central advocacy partners in Scotland in the Forth Valley have pioneered running Own My Life with women with learning disabilities, and it has been amazing. And so we are doing an easy read version to make it more accessible for women anywhere who are being supported, who have learning disabilities, who can access a journal that is as useful as possible. And actually, we are considering how that might be useful for people whose first language is BSL, for instance. distance, because actually that it will be much more accessible for lots of different people as well. So we're really excited to have that. The Own My Life course is run by female officers in the Met Police, for female officers and staff within the workforce. And actually the challenge for female officers is often that their partner will also be a police officer. And so this is police perpetrated abuse very often. So there's huge complexity if we are a police officer, a social worker, a health professional. We can often really struggle to access support through our local domestic abuse service because we might be working professionally with women. And actually, can you imagine if we go to a group and we say, I am a police officer, we're not necessarily going to be very welcomed into the sisterhood. So it's amazing to see the Met Police creating a sisterhood of women who have a similar reality around that. And so we are keen to see other police forces take on Own My Life as a support for female officers. And we'd love to see that happen within social care, within health practitioners as well, because I think there is a real need for people to have that support. We've just piloted our first Northern Irish course, and that went really well. And so we want to grow the coverage in Northern Ireland. So we've got coverage across the rest of the UK, but Northern Ireland has been quite new to us. We've got quite a lot of coverage in the Republic of Ireland, actually. We have seen some women on day release from prison who've attended an Own My Life course, and we are desperate to see more women in the criminal justice system having access to Own My Life. And we're seeing more women both in addiction recovery and women who have lost children to the state, who have a really complex experience of motherhood, who have found Own My Life really transformative. As I mentioned before, we've got resources around gambling harm, and we also have a set of resources for women who've been trafficked. So a lot of Own My Life is essentially useful for all women, like regardless of circumstances. It's not, a lot of people come in our training who've never been subject to abuse, and they're like, every woman should do this course, because it does enable people to, as women, for us to locate ourselves in a transformative way and be more able to own our lives, because all of us are subject to all sorts of systems that impact us. And within the course, we talk about intersectionality. We have a video on intersectionality, and I think, the work that you're doing on this podcast and generally around recognizing the particular barriers that are increased for women. You talked about actually having a job and your working class background giving you the kind of passion and commitment to retain your job in spite of having a partner who was trying to control that. Actually, social class is a huge challenge. Middle class women often struggle to access services because services are assumed to be for working class people. Working class professionals are often assumed then to be needing help. When they go to work with a client, they're then assumed to be seeking help. The same with disability, with neurodiversity, with race or ethnicity, with where we live or where we're from. All of these different things are challenges for us to be able to get the support we need. And so what we're finding is Own My Life is particularly transformative for women who often are struggling because of intersectional reasons, either because they're a police officer or because they're in active addiction, or whatever situation they're in, they're struggling to fit into the box that often domestic abuse services have parameters, and often women who don't sit within those parameters struggle. And so for us at Own My Life, one of the things we're deeply passionate about is how do we get this to women where they are, rather than waiting for women to get to that point where they go, oh, this is the A word of abuse, I should go to this service. How do we get this into workforces? How do we get this into addiction services? And so for us, that's the thing we're really passionate about, is how do we make this something that women get access to and then are enabled to see, this is abuse, this gives me the resources to help me move forward. So we're very excited to be able to see things moving forward.
And there is also a free resource in YouTube, isn't there, for co-parenting?
Yeah, so we've created a video that is available for free, and it's got a resource pack about counter-parenting. So this might be while we're still with our partner, because very often if we've got children, our partner will be using those children as part of those control mechanisms. But often it's once we leave that we can really identify and see the way they're doing that. It's usually the same tactics, they just are different when we're no longer living with them or in a relationship with them. And so this resource is both a video, which gives you a sense of what the Own My Life videos are like, and then a resource pack that women can use to think about how do we how do we effectively parent when we've got someone who's essentially making this a war zone unnecessarily? So the Counter Parent resource is available on our website. I'll give you the link so that you can make it available, and it is available on YouTube as well. Yeah.
And if anyone wants to help move this forward, what ways would be helpful to yourself?
Yeah. Well, tell people about it. We're desperate to see Own My Life available in every town and area. It's got quite a lot of coverage, but if you work in an organisation which could deliver groups for women, do get in touch because we can train you up to do that. If you, we are a charity, a registered charity, so people can donate to us. As you said, Sonia, you've been supporting us with developing a Spanish translation. We're really keen to see the most important, I would say, inclusivity thing that we can do is translate Own My Life into different languages. It is probably, and it's actually the thing there's no funding for. It is so difficult to get funding for translation, and not having it in somebody's mother tongue is probably the biggest barrier to women getting meaningful access to the resources they need. So anybody who speaks any other language, we're really keen for anybody who wants to volunteer with us to get that translation done into different languages. And just get in touch if you've heard what we're doing and you're passionate about how we do it. We can talk about if there's any skills or resources that would enable us to grow. And really, I think just the stuff that we've talked about today, just bringing that into the relationships you have with friends, family, colleagues, the mum that you meet at the school gate if you have kids, that I think just that sense of taking this stuff and seeing it as everybody's responsibility to make women's lives better. And that's the most important thing that any of us can do, is to see this as our responsibility to be part of the solution and to resourcing women. And if this is our own story, we are resisting these systems just when we live the best lives we can, when we live with joy and hope. And that is, if this is our own story, every day that we get up, live our lives, have joy and hope, and continue to believe that goodness is possible, we resist what abusers want, which is that the world is terrible and that we just have to do as we're told. So we believe that every woman who's subject to abuse is bad, absolutely badass. And so keep going, walking in badassery, and in doing that, you're making the world a better place as women.
Conversations like this make me really happy that I started the podcast. It was amazing. Thank you so much, Natalie, for joining, and all for the incredible work that you're doing to change people's lives. And to everyone listening, thank you for being part of this conversation, and we hope it stays with you and sparks reflection and inspires action. So this has been Intersecting Voices, and until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Thank you for tuning into the Intersecting Voices podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to leave us a review on Spotify or YouTube. Your feedback helps us grow and bring you even better content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. See you next time.